Holiday trips halted. A big storm sweeps up the East Coast, stalling busy Thanksgiving travel. Hong Kong arrests. Police crack down on some student leaders after months of protests. Spiritual sojourn. Pope Francis envisions the church on a journey through history towards paradise. And vivid memories. Veterans from the greatest generation bring World War II stories to life. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, November 26, 2014. Happy Thanksgiving and good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Thanksgiving travelers are bracing for long delays as a major storm turns rain into snow across much of the Northeast tonight. Wyatt Goolsby reports from Washington's Ronald Reagan National Airport. Wyatt?
Brian, for thousands here on the East Coast and in the Mid-Atlantic region, this could not come at a worse time. This is already one of the busiest travel days of the year, but the snow, ice, and the rain are all right now impacting flights here and across the country.
It might be a long day for the tens of millions heading out the door. This year, air and road travel nationally is expected to be at 46 million. It's the highest number since 2007.
The security lines will be longer. Everything's going to take a little longer.
Lon Anderson with AAA says patience will be key for anyone traveling the next 2 days, especially if you're doing any driving.
Getting there safely should be the goal. It's not how fast you can make the trip. Not on a day when, just in the Washington area, we're projecting over 1 million folks driving away for their holiday.
Across the nation, some 500 flights have already been canceled. The biggest delays today have been at Newark International, Philadelphia International, and New York's LaGuardia.
So my best advice to air travelers is to call ahead to your airline, find out about the status of your specific flight before you come to the airport.
Those airports affected the most are bringing in additional crews and snow equipment just in case. Meanwhile, some major airlines dropped their ticket change fees for people flying in and out of the Northeast, allowing passengers to try to sneak on an earlier flight. While it has been difficult, so far most flyers have been able to travel.
I bought my flight as an 11:30 flight to try to just leave before the really bad weather hits and it possibly cancels or delays a lot of flights.
We stuck with our flight plan. We got here slightly earlier just because it's the day before Thanksgiving, but so far so good.
Throughout the afternoon, airport crews have been working to treat slippery and snowy tarmacs. That hasn't been too big of a problem here at Reagan International Airport, but we can tell you that for a lot of those airlines that have flights going out of or through the Northeast, there are still a lot of residual delays, and so that's the big question here, is how those delays will affect airlines across the country. Brian?
All right, thanks, Wyatt Goolsby at Reagan International Airport. Some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. The early morning shooting of 2 FBI agents in St. Louis County is not directly related to the Ferguson protests, according to the Bureau. This happened just 5 miles away from Ferguson. The 2 special agents were shot as they helped University City Police execute an arrest warrant. One agent was hit in the shoulder, the other in the leg. Their injuries are not life-threatening. Well, tonight is calmer, but the crisis is far from over in Ferguson on this day before Thanksgiving. Susanne LaFrankie covers that continuing drama there.
That's right, Brian, and good evening. Officials in nearby St. Louis have postponed the city's annual Thanksgiving Day parade, still mindful of the explosive nature of the situation. Meanwhile, emotions on both sides remain raw and unpredictable.
Overnight, National Guard reinforcements had a calming effect on the streets of Ferguson. The increased troops were better able to contain protesters, which were far less destructive than the night after the grand jury's decision was announced, with arrests cut in half. Some were still angry, with over 100 protests in cities across the country. In an interview with ABC News, Officer Darren Wilson, in his first public appearance since the shooting, said he has a clean conscience because he said he knows he did his job right, that he never wanted to take anybody's life, and feels sorry about Brown's death. However, Brown's mother told CBS News that she doesn't believe a word of Wilson's account and wondered how anybody's conscience could be clear after killing someone. Although Wilson was not indicted, he still remains the subject of a federal civil rights investigation. Last night, Attorney General Eric Holder promised swift action to restore trust between police and citizens.
The department's investigations will continue to be thorough, they will continue to be independent, and they remain ongoing.
Speaking in Chicago, President Obama said that Ferguson is symptomatic of a larger underlying problem, adding violence is never acceptable.
There are productive ways of responding and expressing those frustrations, and there are destructive ways of responding. Burning buildings, torching cars, destroying property, putting people at risk, that's destructive, and there's no excuse for it.
Attorneys for the Brown family vow to continue to fight for the federal charges against Wilson. Regardless of the outcome of the investigation, Brown's family could also file a wrongful death lawsuit against the police officer. Brian?
All right, thanks, Suzanne. The Environmental Protection Agency proposes stricter smog standards today. This announcement was expected, fulfilling one of the president's original campaign promises. The EPA proposes changing the threshold for ozone pollution to 65 to 70 parts per billion from the current 75 parts per billion. The agency is under a court deadline to issue these new smog standards. Opponents of the change say it'll cost jobs and reduce America's competitiveness. Now, if the new rules are approved, states would have 20 years to meet these guidelines. Costs to industry could run between $4 and $15 billion, depending on the exact standards adopted. Obamacare has enrolled more than 460,000 people during this year's new enrollment period. Some who signed up last year are finding higher costs with automatic re-enrollments. The White House has announced more outreach to try to bolster enrollment. Storefronts are being set up at shopping malls starting on Black Friday. Daniel Halper from the Weekly Standard is joining us now for a Washington headline wrap-up. Let's go first with Ferguson. Is the president's approach to Ferguson effective?
I think it's getting better and better. President Obama, throughout his presidency, has frequently addressed crises, local law enforcement crises that have blown up into national stories. Previously with the Trayvon Martin, of course, and with the Skip Gates, even before that, the Harvard professor who got arrested, he became, I think, a little too involved and a little too personal about it. Now I think he's beginning to gain some distance, gain some perspective, encourage calm, and remind people that looting and rioting is criminal activity, or can be criminal activity when it's done the way it's been happening in Ferguson.
He's learning to be a little more presidential. Huh?
You could say so.
Yeah. Do you expect the Justice Department to take any action here?
I don't think that there's just much of a case against him. You know, there's still thousands of pages that have been released from the grand jury that just came out a couple days ago, so I haven't gone through every single page of it, but I don't really understand what the case against him would be. It's hard to suggest that if Michael Brown wasn't a big white man who went after him in the same way, that the same result wouldn't have happened. We don't, obviously that's a hypothetical that we will never be sure of, but there's no clear evidence that this had anything to do with the race. That would be a racial investigation. That's why I don't think that there's any case against him.
Turning to immigration, how do you think the president added fuel to the fire with some comments he made in Chicago last night?
Well, President Obama went to Chicago to tout his immigration plan last night. He made an admission. He was heckled for several minutes, actually. It was kind of striking. And he made an admission when he said, "Why are you guys heckling me? I changed the law." The exact quote is, "I just took an action to change the law." Now, the executive amnesty order that he signed last week, it was all, the argument from the White House was that, you know, this is well within the confines of the law. So he wasn't changing the law. He was just using prosecutorial discretion on how to enforce the law. Now, his admission last night that he's changing the law, I think that fuels a lot of the Republican criticism. They can point to that and say, you yourself are saying that you're changing the law. Congress's role is to change the law, not the president's role.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll hear about that from Republicans. How do you think they'll respond now?
Well, they're going to come back for after Thanksgiving. I think they're still plotting how to respond. Granted, they have a couple weeks until the Republicans are seated in the Senate, until the new Congress is seated. I think they're going to go after the funding of this law change, and as they'll now say, because I think they hold the power of the purse, and there'll be a game of chicken as to who's going to decide whether or not what happens next. And it will be tricky. They'll probably get some blame for things going wrong. But listen, I also think a lot of the reason the Republicans were elected in the last election is to just say no to President Obama. It wasn't just elected for a positive agenda. It was also to stop what many people are finding bad about what's going on in Washington.
Some Democrats continue distancing themselves from the president and specifically Obamacare. Chuck Schumer of New York.
Yes, it was striking. Yesterday, Chuck Schumer made a case that Democrats and President Obama in particular shouldn't have done Obamacare when they did it. I think it's a key moment for the 2016 election. It allows Democrats to seek a little distance from the president. It's kind of akin to Republicans starting to turn against George W. Bush's Iraq war. They can say, you know, that wasn't really, we're not really against it, and it gives them a little distance so they can see a new way forward for their party after President Obama. And he's a lame duck already. I mean, this is how the people in their own party treat a lame duck president.
Very quickly, the resignation of Hagel. The timing on that surprise you?
It did surprise me. I think earlier that day there was also an announcement that the White House had extended its talks with Iran, suggesting that perhaps the announcement was meant to bury some bad news or some controversial news, since they're going ahead with their nuclear talks with Iran and giving Iran an extension for what appears to be no good reason, really.
So, all right, a lot of interesting news from Washington. Daniel Halper with the Weekly Standard. Thanks for
Thank you, and happy Thanksgiving.
And you too. Well, gunmen in southwest Pakistan killed 4 health workers administering polio vaccines earlier today. 2 attackers opened fire on the team, killing 3 women and a man, injuring 3 others. Local militants oppose the vaccine campaigns, claiming they're covering Western spy programs. Health officials said attacks like this would not stop the immunizations. Polio can cause paralysis and even death. Pakistan is one of only 3 places in the world where the disease remains endemic. A pontifical council and the unions of superior generals announced the first International Day of Prayer and Reflection on Human Trafficking. Around 21 million people are victims of human trafficking through sexual exploitation, forced labor, illegal adoption, and other forms of abuse. This according to the International Labor Organization and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Human trafficking is one of the most lucrative illegal activities. It generates an estimated $32 billion a year. The International Day of Prayer and Reflection on Human Trafficking will be held February 8th, the feast day of St. Josephine Bakita, a Sudanese slave who was canonized in 2000. Pope Francis describes the church as being on a journey through history towards paradise. Those attending his audience today in St. Peter's Square took a journey through the rain. A sea of umbrellas in St. Peter's Square, but the crowd's in good spirits. Vatican Radio reports the Pope also asked people to pray for his trip this weekend to Turkey. He leaves Friday morning for visits to Ankara and Istanbul. It's his first visit to that predominantly Muslim country. Restoration work began today at Rome's Colosseum after a tourist tried to carve initials into that historic structure. A reddish-yellow stucco was used to cover up the large letter K. The Russian tourist responsible for the damage was fined 20,000 euros. It's the 5th time this year the Colosseum has been vandalized. Rome's union leaders complain there aren't enough people monitoring the Eternal City's archaeological treasures. Closed-circuit cameras and custodians are constantly keeping an eye out. Coming up, a history lesson on the Christian roots of our yearly celebration of Thanksgiving. We're very grateful you're joining us for EWTN News Nightly as we give thanks for each of you. I'm Brian Patrick. Mitt Romney says he has no plans to run for president, but some voters would like to see him back on the campaign trail. According to a new Quinnipiac University poll, Romney polled the most support among Republican voters as a potential 2016 presidential nominee. Former Florida Governor Jeb Bush came in second. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie and neurosurgeon Dr. Ben Carson are tied for third. So far, no Republican has officially announced a run for the White House. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is recovering in a Washington area hospital after a heart procedure. A court spokesperson says the 83-year-old justice had a stent placed in her heart coronary artery this morning. Ginsburg reportedly experienced discomfort during routine exercise last night and was taken to the hospital. She is expected to return home within 48 hours. Justice Ginsburg was appointed to the High Court in 1993. Well, it's a Thanksgiving tradition. The president pardoning one lucky turkey the day before Thanksgiving. A turkey named Cheese won an online voting contest, competing against Mac, who will also be spared the axe. Cheese is nearly 50 pounds and was raised on an Ohio farm. With his pardoning, he moves to a Northern Virginia turkey farm where he will live out the rest of his days. President Obama says in the midst of all the tough issues in the world, it's still nice to say Happy Thanksgiving. Well, Thanksgiving is one of only 2 religiously rooted holidays recognized by the federal government. According to the Smithsonian, the observance goes back to 1623 in Plymouth, Massachusetts. As the story goes, a drought left the early colonists praying and fasting for relief. Well, after the rains came, they held a day of thanksgiving and prayer. Over time, it's become what we know today as our Thanksgiving celebration. Reverend Rob Schenk is president of Faith in Action, a Christian outreach ministering to top-level government officials in the nation's capital. The U.S. has no official religion, but didn't some of our founding fathers truly, openly give thanks to God for who we are and what we have?
Founding fathers and founding mothers. In fact, it actually goes back long before the Republic to the middle 1500s when the Spanish explorers had feasts of Thanksgiving, the French Huguenots that came to what we now know as Florida. 1500s we're talking about. 1600s came the Pilgrims, Jamestown settlers, all the way up through George Washington, first presidential proclamation. And now we have a law that makes this day a Thanksgiving holiday.
It's a national holiday. Do you think it's lost some of that religious tone over the years?
I think to some extent it has, as we've moved toward a more secularized culture, but it still harkens back to a time when we placed our thanks where it belongs, which is with Almighty God, and that memory is still very much alive.
You minister to political leaders. Some are Christians, some aren't. Some may not even have a religion. Is there any value, do you think, for them and for us to give thanks, even if it's not directed toward God?
Yes, I think so. In fact, I think an attitude of thanksgiving is very consistent with virtue, and living a virtuous life is very much consistent with living a godly life. So whether you acknowledge God or not, by having an attitude of gratitude, being thankful to others is an act of honoring human dignity. All that is terribly important and very appropriate. So I think, yes, just a general attitude of thanksgiving is good for all of us.
I call it an attitude of gratitude. And of course, in our Catholic tradition, the term the Eucharist, which we celebrate at Mass, means thanksgiving. It's Greek. Your own family has a very interesting mix of religious views. How does that work out for you around Thanksgiving? Especially?
Actually, wonderfully. Our family has Jewish, Christian, and Muslim all around the Thanksgiving table. And on Thanksgiving Day, we're together and we love one another and express thanks to God together and to one another, for one another. So for us, it works very well. When people say, well, there's no way these people can get along with each other, I say, just come to our Thanksgiving Day table and you'll see that, in fact, we can. And we do it every Thanksgiving and a lot of other occasions, too.
Do you ever look around the Thanksgiving table and say, if the world could do this, it'd be a better place?
As a matter of fact, I do. And I pray and I hope and I work towards that. And because I see it in my own family, I know it can happen.
What are you most thankful for on this Thanksgiving?
I'm most thankful that I can publicly thank God and I can express my love and appreciation to others in a society like ours. I hope we can preserve that freedom because it's a rare gift, rare around the world. So I'm very, very thankful that I can be thankful openly and I don't have to make any apologies for that.
Well, I'm very grateful that you're able to take that message to our political leaders because I think that bodes very well for their future. Thank you, Reverend Schenk. We appreciate you being with us.
My pleasure.
Well, police in Hong Kong are cracking down on protesters trying to quell a 2-month-old occupation movement there. Jason Calvi has the story.
One of the Hong Kong student protest leaders, Joshua Wong, stands up to authorities today before being sent to jail. Police say they've arrested about 150 people in the last day. Yesterday, court bailiffs enforced an order to remove blockades in one part of the city, but some wouldn't move, so the police swept in. Some stayed and faced off with police.
Some protest leaders, especially the students, they are ready to be arrested to demonstrate their readiness to sacrifice.
The number of protesters have sunk, though. Organizers say 200,000 were on the streets when the protests began 2 months ago. They've continued to raise their voices, opposing a move to let a China communist-linked panel pick candidates for the city's first elections in 2017.
Actually, we haven't achieved anything yet. We are nothing. I believe we are still fighting for the right thing. We believe the majority of people would want a fair system.
But a recent University of Hong Kong poll found that 83% of residents want the occupation to end. Older pro-democracy leaders are urging the students to retreat.
My recommendation has been that we should withdraw to a smaller area in the Admiralty district so as to minimize the inconveniences causing the Hong Kong population.
And it's not just occupiers facing arrest. Today, Hong Kong police say 7 of their own officers have been arrested for beating a protester back in October. Hong Kong's leader says the government does remain willing to dialogue regarding political reform. Brian?
All right, thank you. Jason Calvi. Up next, history comes alive at a museum retelling the riveting drama of the Second World War. Our EWTN News Nightly team giving thanks for the wider EWTN family. We appreciate you watching tonight. I'm Brian Patrick, and as you plan your holiday shopping, be aware of a federal warning about an influx of counterfeit products. Fake watches, headphones, and cell phone cases flood stores and online markets during the holiday season. Federal agencies are intensifying operations targeting the importing and distribution of these fake goods.
This is not a victimless crime. Through the sale of these counterfeit items, there are Americans that lose their jobs. There are corporations and American companies that have copyright and trademark that are losing money on this.
Consumers are warned to guard against buying low-quality items and sharing personal financial information. Well, to some, World War II may seem like a distant history or a distant memory, but the memories are still very real for veterans from the greatest generation. Catherine Zeltner explores an exhibit bringing that reality to museum visitors.
Cheese, guys! The National World War II Museum in New Orleans, one of the only places in the world to hear daily first-hand accounts from the men who served.
When we went into the water, we got separated.
Like 95-year-old Bert Stolier, whose ship was torpedoed in 1942.
And I was in the water by myself for 3 days and 3 nights.
Losing hope of rescue, he found comfort in memories of home and song.
Smile, though your heart is breaking. Smile, even though it's aching.
A tide shift on the 3rd day carried Stolier closer to passing ships, and he took a chance.
I swam around the back, and I looked up, and there was that gorgeous flag.
Stolier's story is one of the countless told since the museum first opened in 2000. Its exhibits have been seen by more than 4 million visitors, and the museum has grown from just 1 building to 5, with 2 more to come. The newest pavilion, Campaigns of Courage, opens to the public on December 13th with the exhibit Road to Berlin. It includes high-tech interactive displays, as well as personal stories and artifacts, like this German staff car in the Battle of the Bulge Gallery, and sand from the beaches of Normandy, dotted with helmets, weapons, toothbrushes, and other debris that washed ashore after D-Day.
We want people to understand what happened, why it happened, and what it means today.
Clem Goldberger donated a photograph of her father holding a sign after his infantry breached the Siegfried Line, one of Adolf Hitler's main defenses. She brought him to the museum before his passing.
I think it gave him some peace, some closure.
And for veterans like Stolier, some purpose.
I love being here, and it makes me feel good.
He loves being there, and we love to hear his stories. No Thanksgiving is complete without the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. A half-dozen new balloons will float down 6th Avenue in New York City tomorrow. Some of the newcomers include the Pillsbury Doughboy, the Red Power Ranger, Thomas the Tank Engine, and Paddington Bear. More than 40 giant balloons will grace this year's parade. Tomorrow it'll be 90 years since the very first Thanksgiving Day Parade. We're off tomorrow to celebrate Thanksgiving with our families. Until Monday, we encourage you to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and we leave you tonight with some moments from the Pope's general audience in St. Peter's Square today. Good night, God bless you, and happy Thanksgiving.